Hello and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom AP European History Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is lecture number 1, Setting the Stage, i.e. the Late Middle Ages. When I say setting the stage, I mean setting the stage for what comes next. Which if you don't know, well, hey, you're in the right class. So as I always say, take a moment, hit pause on this video. Take a moment, jot down that lecture outline to the left, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the right. You should be able to identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. Now you will note, those of you who know me very well, this is not my usual background. I just like to be a little different this year. And so you will see I have a number of more creative backgrounds this year, just because I can. Anyway, let's get started. Now, the late Middle Ages is leading up to what we would refer to as the Renaissance period. And of course, the Renaissance is kind of the official kickoff point when it comes to AP European history, because European history, AP Euro, only covers from 1450 to present. In other words, this is the era in which the West was developed, the West became civilized, and the West became great. How do we make Europe great again? It starts in the Renaissance. But before you can understand and appreciate the Renaissance, you need to understand what happened before. And full disclosure, this is not something I came up with this year in 2020. It's something I came up with a couple years back. This is where you start AP European history, but as you will see, it's a very apt lecture when it comes to, well, our current situation. So, the time of the late Middle Ages, the 14th and 15th century, leading up to the Renaissance, what was it like? Well, let's see. It was a time of great trouble, a time of famine, a time in which there was a climate change going on. Now, this is one of those cyclical climate changes wherein the shift to cooler temperatures began to create shortened growing seasons. It created more bad weather, including more storms, constant rainfall, and this would cause extreme shortages of food, causing hunger and, yes, starvation. In other words, by the late Middle Ages, again, this is all pre-industrial revolution where we had all these new farming techniques, industrial techniques. By this point, Europe has reached its upper limit of population. And the result of is a drastically increased population of poor people. All the productive land was already being farmed, and all the marginal land is being farmed. Given the techniques that were available to them, the status quo, if you will. The result was they've been tapped out. They have gotten to the limits of their population limits. They can no longer produce enough food to sustain the population, and thus more and more people are becoming destitute and poor. Famine has been brought on, in part due to climate change. Thus, 10%, it is estimated, of the population is killed due to this famine pestilence caused by the shift in temperature and no longer have any food for people. In addition, we start seeing a number of people in this situation, those who live, they begin to migrate from their rural farming areas into these urban cities. Why? They have no hope in the farms. And therefore, they need to find somewhere, something to hold their hat on and hope for. So many end up going to the cities, which in the beginning is a good idea, right? There's some infrastructure there. There's a few more people that may be able to help you out. But as we're going to see, it's going to cause and trigger a bigger phenomenon. Now, one final note about this period, this famine will lead to chronic malnutrition. So even if you get food, you're only eating one type of food maybe, and therefore you will be nutrient deficient. You will have a drastically increased infant mortality. We will have lower birth rates. and higher susceptibility to disease. Let's see. Malnutrition, socioeconomically poor, higher susceptibility to disease, low birth rates to replace population. Oh, and we're going to crowd into cities. Let's see. I think we are ripe in setting the stage for a pandemic. A pandemic the likes of which no one's ever seen, aka the Black Death. The Black Death will officially, the years are from 1347 to 1351. By the way, I just love my little image here of Rat Thanos. About ready to snap his fingers because estimates are as such that 1/4 to 1/2 of the European population will die. So, just like Thanos, half the all living things are going to die. Up to 1/2, that is. Now, please note that the origination of the Black Death was in fact from Asia. That was carried there through the trade routes. So I guess, hey, let's just blame Asia for this problem, right? It wasn't our fault. We were already destitute and living in poor houses and crowded in the cities that will facilitate its spread, but let's blame somebody else for it. You're not, taking any responsibility of our own. Now, ultimately, what does carry the Black Death back from Asia along these trade routes is via rodents, especially rats on boats. And usually, it's not the rats specifically, it's the fleas on the rats that carry this bacteria, and it will manifest itself in 3 different forms. The first one is known as bubonic. So you hear bubonic plague. The bubonic plague was spread by fleas on the backs of Asian rats. Symptoms include fever, aching, swelling, dark splotches beneath the skin. The second form of Black Death was known as pneumonic. It's often spread, it's an airborne virus spread by cough. Bacteria is spread to the lungs after you inhale it from water droplets in the air, and it will cause your lungs to bleed. Very painful. You'll be coughing blood, obviously. And then there's the third version, which is known as septicemic. Easy for me to say. Septemic, there we go. This is spread by insects. And the infected, this is actually the worst of them. Because, the other ones, you have some time, you'll start seeing symptoms. The septicemic version of the plague is spread by insects, and the infected will usually die within a day. Yes, this is this bad. So over the next 5 to 12 years, the plague is going to hit and then kind of subside. Hey, we flattened the curve, and then it'll hit again. Oh, another wave. We flattened, yay! It'll hit again. So on and off again over the late 14th into the 15th century. There will still be some other rounds, though the main thrust of it is that 1347 to 1351 range. And so you'll see some symptoms like this, the bulbous. And you can see the trade route there that brings it across. You see the septicemia form with an almost 100% mortality rate. So why was this so bad? I mean, again, this is just a virus, right? What's the harm of virus? Surely there's less than 1% death rate, no harm can come. Oh, wait, wrong virus. Why is it so bad? Well, number one, overcrowding in cities. Remember that rural to urban migration I talked about? Well, you're going into these overcrowded cities and homes that are dirty. There's no sewer systems. And this is a breeding ground for disease on a normal basis. Now create and inject this infectious, highly infectious disease, spread 3 different ways, and you are looking at a, plague, for lack of a better term, a pandemic. So overcrowded in cities. In addition, even many aristocratic families often slept in one room. Many peasant families would sleep in one bed just for warmth. I mean, this was not necessarily a poor, rich thing here. but rather this was done for warmth. It was cold in Europe. Remember, we told you it was colder, the climate change? And so this is by the way, this is for the wealthier peasants who were sleeping in one bed. They did it for warmth's sake. Now, if you're a poor person, you didn't even have that. You didn't have a bed. You're sleeping on the dirt, on the stone, in the refuse. And poor sanitation in the cities, garbage-filled streets, human excrement everywhere, and of course, random dead animals that are breeders of insects like flies and spreaders of disease. And of course, you were already in poor health due to widespread malnutrition, i.e., you're immunocompromised, that makes you more susceptible to disease. Oh, and things get worse because, in the early 14th century, up to 25% of the crops were destroyed due to torrential downpours that resulted in cannibalism among many Europeans. Yes, you heard me right, they ate each other. And of course, poor hygiene, because many people did believe, and they were correctly believed, that their water was contaminated, and therefore they feared taking baths. Remember the story from Jamestown, urinated fecal water? Well, combine that with other noxious toxins, and people were afraid to take a bath, which makes them more dirty, and again, more susceptible to disease like a plague, i.e. the Black Death. And so, how do people react to this? I mean, you're seeing between 1/4 and 1/2 of your population dead, dying, sick. How do you react to this? How do you view this? Now, there's a number of different reactions to this. The first one is often religious, and it became known as flagellante. Now, basically, you're going to flagellate yourself to pay some type of penance. And, of course, on the one hand, religious people view this as God's wrath. And so clergymen often would flee the cities to escape the disease. Hey, they could do so, right? But then they turn around and say, well, we're not getting it, so it must be because you are sexually immoral. You are indulging. You are living in the moment, carpe diem. You are indulging in both sexual and alcoholic orgies. And therefore, it is your moral decrepence that is causing you to die. And this is being buttressed by the fact that clergymen are able to escape, not get sick, and by that the extremely wealthy leave their urban estates and move out into the country where there's less people to get infected by them. And therefore, they believe that this plague was God's way of cleansing the sinner from the earth. Now, because they believe this was a result of sin, they would often do things to try to atone for that sin to avoid getting sick themselves. Hence the flagellation or flagellants. Flagellants were people who would produce self-produced pain and torture. Remember my torture lecture? In this case, they would use whips that often they were made of leather, the whip was, and so when it whipped your back, it would hurt. But they would make it worse by adding spike-studded leather tips to literally rip the skin off their backs as they whip themselves. Again, this was seen as a way to atone for their sins. Apparently, they actually never read the Bible, which this makes sense. It was half the clergy couldn't read anyway. And this was often not only done to themselves, but often done to people they believed were extremely sinful, i.e. Jews. And so Jews were often becoming the scapegoat when it came to trying to deal with outbreaks like this. So, right, they became a scapegoat. Like, well, it must be the Jews' fault. They killed Jesus. Wait. Jesus was a Jew. Fun fact, in case you didn't know. And so they would do things like the flagellants. They would do things like leeching. They would literally put leeches on their body to suck out the poison toxins and remove the blood. This was common. Again, Jews became this very popular scapegoat. And much like you'll see in World War II under Hitler, they're entered in what were called pogroms. These seemingly obligatory, violence against Jews for the sole purpose of just oppressing them because they killed Jesus. And they were often forced to wear designated clothing or patches that said, "Yep, I'm a Jew." Now, in other words, life was rough. The economies in these towns are suffering mightily as people are literally dying. There's no more people to work the jobs. When someplace between 1/3 and 1/2 of your population is decimated and gone. In some cities, especially like Florence, Italy, we'll talk about them in next lecture about the Renaissance, over half their population died. How does a town recover from this? And we learn from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Endgame, life is not always better when half your people die. Go figure. Now, of course, what we do find here is that the death is atrocious, it is horrific, it is terrible. There is violence against Jews because they are blamed for this. But I want to pull away from the death for a moment here. And instead, just talk about the impact socially and economically. Because there's a lot of death going on, and that's, concerning. It causes ripple effects in society. We should know. We're going through a pandemic in 2020. We understand it causes economic dissolution. It causes economic problems. It causes social problems. It causes tensions to flare. So what does it cause in 15th, 16th century Europe? Well, we're going to see first and foremost that a number of revolts. You see, within European society, for the most part, we see that there is what's called the three estate system. There was the clergy, those who pray, the nobility, those who fight, and the laborers, those who work. And during this point, we see that there's a problem because most of those who worked, i.e. the laborers, are known as serfs. Now, serfs, of course, is technically not slavery by definition. Now, for all practical purposes, it is because you are literally tied to one land, one landlord. And so the lord of the land, you work for them, you must stay there, you can't leave. Technically not a slave. There's some subtle differences we'll discuss in a future lecture. But you are technically not a slave, but you are stuck and tied to that land. However, during this period, this is actually going to cause some good things for serfs because serfs will no longer be tied to one master due to a massive labor shortage. And laborers who actually got paid, they will see a wage increase from 2 shillings a week to 7 and then to 11 shillings a week. They went from 2 to 11 shillings as a result of the plague. Why? Because they need someone to work, and therefore supply and demand. There is less supply, more demand, therefore they get more money. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say this was a good thing in the long run. It's not. Because of the fact that even though that they will get paid more, they're still going to cause a great recession, economic depression due to the loss of manpower overall. But it will also begin to show a number of revolts as people begin to, fight back. Now, for instance, let me give you an example of a couple of revolts, right? And so there would be a small peasant revolt. In fact, the result of the peasant revolt is that serfdom in Western Europe, for the most part, and again, not every single place, don't misquote me, but for the most part, serfdom will be ended in Western Europe as a result of the plague because people are no longer tied to one landlord. In addition, this revolt, which will help cause this, again, they're going to revolt, they will do things like burn castles, murder nobles. They're blaming the elites because, they're stuck in poverty while the elites are able to leave their cities, leave their mansions, and go off and live by themselves to avoid the plague. But don't worry, this peasant revolt we're talking about here, in France is going to be put down as the elite privileged class will rise back up and unite together and massacre the rebels. So if the Black Plague didn't get you, you will be killed when you try to revolt in protest against your, suffering. And then in 1381, there will be an English peasant revolt. So that was France. There's one in England. In the English peasant revolt in 1381, there will be a revolt against the poll tax, which was a monarchy attempt to raise revenues during a plague. You might not want to raise taxes during a plague when people are already suffering. Just go figure. The business result of this one, so as peasants begin to expel tax collectors from their villages, burn down the manors, and murder officials, King Richard II will, in fact, listen this time and eliminate the poll tax. So the French one did not work, but the English one did. In either way, the result was serfdom was ended, for the most part, in Western Europe. Now, this is in the rural areas. These are the farmers, right? The peasant farmers. In the cities, there would also be a revolt. For example, the Ciampi. The Ciampi are wool workers, and they will revolt when their wages are declined due to lack of trade, lack of demand. Supplies there, but no demand. And they begin to revolt in order to gain the right to form a guild. In a skilled union, a guild. And they want to be represented in government. Wait, hold on. Did I read that right? You're talking about they want to have representation in government. They want to form a union. This is back in the 1300s. Man, those people were smart. Now, as a result of their revolting, not only will serfdom be ended, but we will see better improvements. Now, I'm not saying it's great, but there will be marked improvements in both wages and living conditions, because they fought back against the privileged class during a time of great disorder, i.e., Black Death. And therefore, even though these uprisings would do some major important things, ultimately we won't see long-term goals enacted, as in like, hey, we're going to have great equality here and we're going to have equal representation. That did not happen. So their long-term goals were not met, but short-term goals, like better working conditions, a little better wages, those were met. And of course, the end of the serfdom, which is, again, very important. Now, this is European history, and therefore, one of the most important facets of it, one of the big themes of it, is, of course, art. Now, I will fully admit I am not the biggest art aficionado. That'd be my wife. She took an art history class. She loved it. But she has taken me to enough museums, enough galleries, and her and I were very fortunate for our 10-year anniversary. We took a trip to Italy. We spent a week in Rome. We spent a week in Florence, and also made a little side trip down to Naples and Vesuvius. It was wonderful. And I grew to have a much better appreciation of art. And that is one of the big themes of European history. You have to understand the art and the continuities and change over time, and how art both shapes and reflects society in any given era. And the pre-Renaissance era, this Middle Age period, is of course well represented in art. And it is a product of its time. And in fact, you will notice there's an obsession with death. Can you understand why? Not only do we have the medieval torture we talked about last time, but you also have, of course, the plague, when you see a third to half your population dying. Yeah, there's an obsession with death. And this is one of the most famous arts works of the time, called the Danse Macabre, and the Dance of Death. And of course, you see this dancing skeletons that are dancing among the living to remind viewers of the prevalence of death in society. In fact, Northern Europe specifically developed a very morbid fascination with death that you would later see when we get to what's called the Northern Renaissance. Another one of these. I'm on my screen here. And of course it says, bring out your dead, as the skeletons ride by on horses. Once again, the idea of death and shooting the arrows. Also in music was also, so another form of artwork right here in music. In fact, you've been probably singing about the Black Death your whole life and didn't even realize it. I know I did as a kid. I sang a very popular song known as Ring Around the Rosie, right? So let's go through it real quick and describe it when it was initiated back in the Black Death era. The symptoms of the plague include a rosy red rash in the shape of a ring around the skin. So ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies. So sweet-smelling herbs, pockets and pouches were filled with sweet-smelling herbs, which were then carried due to the belief that the disease was transmitted by smell. By the way, this is a very common theme in medical history, if you study it out. Up until pretty much the 19th century, many people believe that smell would actually carry disease. Because remember, you can smell something that means it's tangibly there, right? But you don't smell a virus or bacteria. We know that now, but back then they believed that just foul smells, garbage, i.e. garbage, was the harbinger of disease and death. So carry a pocket full of posies, flowers, and herbs to ward off this disease. The chorus, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Ashes, ashes refers to the cremation of dead bodies because, remember, we are talking about death rates, right? And people are diseased, and they're afraid if they touch the dead bodies, they will get the disease spread to them. Which is why in 2020, you see some cities around the United States bring in refrigerated trucks to store dead bodies in. Because they are buried mass graves because there's not time, and they don't want to touch the dead bodies. And yes, you will notice on the bottom left there, one of the things that caused the decline of the Black Death was because there was a great fire in London in 1666 that basically kills all the rats that had been transmitting the disease via the water sources. So again, remember, 1347 to 1351 are the main eras of the Black Death. But remember, it keeps coming back in waves over the next 100 plus years. So ashes, ashes, we all fall down, dead. You know what? I think it's a good place to stop right there. Let's stop here for a minute. We'll come back in our second part of this lecture and discuss the 100 Years' War and the decline of the church. Some fascinating things here. But until then, take care and bye-bye.